The scent of pine and damp earth clung to everything inside the lodge, a comforting aroma that spoke of generations of shared memories. My dad, Thomas, built the place from the ground up, stone by painstakingly placed stone, timber he'd felled himself, and seasoned with care. It wasn't just a building. It was an extension of him, a physical manifestation of his love for the land and the simple rhythms of nature. For me, growing up, it was a second home, a refuge from the pressures of school and the expectations that came with being the sheriff's son. Dad wasn't a man of many words, but he communicated volumes through his actions. He taught me how to track deer, how to read the weather, how to respect the delicate balance of the ecosystem. He instilled in me a deep appreciation for the quiet solitude of the woods, a place where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. Those lessons weren't delivered in lectures. They were absorbed through shared experiences. Hours spent sitting silently in a deer stand, the patient wait for a glimpse of a buck, the shared satisfaction of a successful hunt. Becoming sheriff hadn't been my childhood dream. I'd considered law school, maybe even a life in the city, but something about the pull of this land, the responsibility I felt towards the community that had nurtured me, kept me here. And Dad, though he never explicitly said it, was proud that he understood the weight of the badge, the burden of upholding the law, and he knew I wouldn't take the responsibility lightly. The lodge wasn't just a place for hunting. It was our sanctuary, a place where we could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. Every year, we'd host a family gathering there for Thanksgiving. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all crammed into the cozy space, the air thick with the smell of roasting turkey and wood smoke. Christmas was another tradition, complete with a towering tree we'd cut down ourselves and decorate with handmade ornaments. Even now, with my own life and responsibilities, I made it a point to visit the lodge at least once a month. A weekend of fishing in the nearby creek, a solitary hike through the woods, or simply sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. It was always a reset, a way to clear my head and recharge my soul. Dad, now in his late 70s, still spent most of his time there, tending to his garden, maintaining the trails, and simply enjoying the peace and quiet. He deserved that peace, that sanctuary. He'd earned it, which is why, when the call came, the news hit me with the force of a physical blow. The lodge, our sanctuary, was gone, reduced to ashes, and someone, deliberately, had set it on fire. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just an attack on a building. It was an attack on my father, on our family, on everything we held dear. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wouldn't rest until I brought the person responsible to justice. But what I didn't know then was just how tangled the web of deceit and resentment had become, or the lengths to which someone would go to satisfy their own petty grievances. The seeds of destruction, I realized, had been sown long before the fire. It all started with the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and more specifically, with Deborah, its self-appointed guardian of all things pristine and perfectly manicured. Our property, while technically within the boundaries of the HOA, was grandfathered in. Dad had owned the land for decades before the development sprung up around it, a sprawling testament to suburban conformity. The HOA rules, with their meticulously detailed guidelines on lawn height, acceptable paint colors, and prohibited parking zones, never applied to us. Until Deborah arrived. She moved into the McMansion at the end of our driveway about 2 years ago, a vision of perfectly coiffed hair, designer handbags, and an unwavering sense of entitlement. From day one, she made it her mission to bring our property into compliance, or, more accurately, to force us to conform to her narrow vision of what a neighborhood should look like. It started with polite, albeit passive-aggressive, notes left on our doorstep, complaints about the unsightly woodpile, the overgrown vegetation, and the rustic appearance of the lodge itself. Dad, a man who valued his privacy and detested confrontation, initially ignored them. He figured she'd eventually get the message. He was wrong. Notes escalated to formal complaints filed with the HOA board. Deborah, of course, was a prominent member of the board, and she used her influence to push her agenda. She argued that our property was a blight on the neighborhood, that it lowered property values, and that it was a safety hazard. Her demands were absurd. She wanted us to pave over our gravel driveway, replace the log siding on the lodge with vinyl, and install an irrigation system to keep our lawn as green as a golf course. The dispute centered primarily on a small section of our land that bordered the HOA's common area, a wooded strip they designated as a nature preserve. Deborah claimed that our activities, hunting, fishing, even hiking, were disturbing the wildlife and damaging the delicate ecosystem. She demanded that we erect a fence along the property line and cease all access to the area. Dad tried to reason with her. He explained that he'd been hunting and fishing on that land for over 50 years. Long before the HOA even existed, he pointed out that he was a responsible steward of the environment, that he respected the wildlife, and that he had no intention of harming anything. But Deborah wasn't interested in reason. She was driven by a sense of self-righteousness, a belief that she knew what was best for everyone, regardless of their wishes or their rights. The HOA board, under Deborah's relentless pressure, began to issue fines, small at first, but they quickly escalated. Dad refused to pay them. He argued that the fines were illegal, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over our property. The legal letters started arriving next. Threats of lawsuits, liens on our property, and even foreclosure. I urged Dad to fight back, to hire a lawyer and challenge the HOA in court. But he was tired. He was weary of the constant harassment, the endless stream of complaints, and the escalating legal threats. He just wanted to be left alone, to enjoy his peace and quiet. "It's not worth it, son," he'd said. "It's just not worth the aggravation." But I knew it was worth it. It was about principle. It was about protecting our rights. And it was about stopping Deborah from getting away with her bullying tactics. I just didn't realize how far she was willing to go, how consumed by her own warped sense of justice she truly was. The fire, I now understood, wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was the culmination of a long and bitter campaign of harassment, a calculated act of malice fueled by years of resentment and a complete disregard for the consequences. And Deborah, I was increasingly certain, was at the heart of it all. Looking back, there were signs, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but as the conflict with Dad intensified, Deborah's behavior grew increasingly erratic. It wasn't just the endless stream of complaints and legal threats. It was the gleam in her eye when she spoke about cleaning up the neighborhood, the almost manic energy she exuded at HOA meetings, the unsettling way she seemed to relish the power she wielded. There were whispers, too, among the other residents, stories of Deborah's past, of similar disputes in previous neighborhoods, of her unwavering belief in her own righteousness and her willingness to go to extreme lengths to get her way. One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman who lived across the street from Deborah, confided in me one day. She said that Deborah had once waged a campaign against a family with young children because they had the audacity to let their kids play in their own backyard after dark. She'd called Child Protective Services multiple times, falsely claiming neglect, and had even started a petition to have them evicted. Another resident, a retired accountant named Mr. Peterson, told me that Deborah had a history of filing frivolous lawsuits against anyone who dared to cross her. He said she was like a dog with a bone. Once she latched onto something, she wouldn't let go. He'd seen her in action, and he warned me to be careful. "That woman is trouble," he'd said. "Serious trouble." At the time, I dismissed these stories as neighborhood gossip, the kind of exaggerated tales that tend to circulate in close-knit communities. But now, in the wake of the fire, they took on a new significance. They painted a picture of a woman who was not only entitled and demanding, but also potentially unstable. A woman capable of anything. I remember one specific incident that occurred a few weeks before the fire. Dad had been clearing some brush near the property line when Deborah approached him. Her face contorted with anger. She accused him of deliberately damaging the nature preserve and threatened to call the police. Dad, as always, remained calm and tried to explain that he was only removing dead branches and overgrown weeds. But Deborah wouldn't listen. She launched into a tirade, screaming and yelling, her voice rising to a fever pitch. I happened to be visiting Dad that day, and I intervened. I calmly introduced myself as the county sheriff and politely asked Deborah to lower her voice. The effect was immediate. Her face paled, and she visibly recoiled. She mumbled something about being within her rights and then stormed off, muttering under her breath. For a moment, I thought that my intervention had diffused the situation. But later that evening, Dad told me that Deborah had returned while I was gone and had vandalized his garden, pulling up his vegetables and trampling his flowers. He hadn't wanted to bother me with it, but the incident left him shaken. It was a petty act of vandalism, but it felt like a deliberate escalation, a warning of things to come. That night, I had a dream that I dreamt that the lodge was engulfed in flames, and I was standing helplessly by, unable to do anything to stop it. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. But the feeling of dread lingered, a sense that something terrible was about to happen. And now, looking at the charred remains of the lodge, I knew that my premonition had come true. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't recognized them for what they were: a descent into madness, a harbinger of destruction. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. I remember the time precisely, because I stared at the bedside clock, willing myself to wake up fully before answering. It was a number I recognized instantly. Dad's cell. My heart lurched. He never called that late unless it was an emergency. Son. His voice was barely a whisper, choked with emotion that I could hear the crackle of static on the line. But beneath it, a deeper sound, the unmistakable roar of flames. Dad, what's wrong? What's happening? I sat bolt upright in bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The lodge, it's gone, son. It's all gone. His words were fragmented, punctuated by ragged breaths. Fire. I tried, couldn't stop it. I struggled to process what he was saying. The lodge gone? It was impossible. That place was more than just a building. It was a part of him, a part of our family. The thought of it being destroyed, of him witnessing its destruction, sent a wave of nausea washing over me. Are you okay, Dad? Are you hurt? That was my immediate concern. The lodge could be rebuilt, memories could be preserved, but his safety was paramount. I'm fine, son, just heartbroken. He paused, and I could hear him fighting back tears. I called 911. The fire department's here, but it's too late. There's nothing left to save. I threw on some clothes and raced out the door, sirens already wailing in the distance. I sped down the highway. Images flashed through my mind. Dad building the lodge, our family gatherings, the countless hours we'd spent together in that sacred space. The anger began to build, a slow-burning rage that threatened to consume me. By the time I arrived, the lodge was a raging inferno, flames leaping high into the night sky, casting an eerie orange glow on the surrounding woods. The heat was intense, even from a distance. Firefighters were battling the blaze, but it was clear that their efforts were futile. The lodge was a total loss. Dad was standing a short distance away, wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the paramedics. He looked small and frail, his face etched with grief. I rushed to his side and wrapped my arms around him. He clung to me tightly, his body trembling. I'm so sorry, Dad, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. He didn't say anything, just squeezed my hand tighter. The fire chief, a man I knew well, approached us. Sheriff, we've contained the fire, but there's nothing left of the structure. It's a complete loss. He paused, his expression grim. The initial assessment points to arson. There were signs of forced entry, and we found traces of accelerant near the back of the building. Arson. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't an accident, a careless mistake. Someone had deliberately set fire to our lodge, to our sanctuary. The rage that had been simmering inside me now erupted into a full-blown inferno. Who would do this, son? Who would do something so evil? Dad's voice was barely audible above the roar of the flames. I looked at him, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. I knew I couldn't tell him what I suspected, not yet. But in that moment, I made a vow that I would find the person responsible for this, and I would make them pay. They had not only destroyed a building, they had shattered my father's heart. And for that, they would face the full force of the law, and perhaps a little bit of my own personal brand of justice, too. The raw, primal urge for revenge clawed at me, a tempest threatening to overwhelm my reason. Every instinct screamed for me to grab Deborah, drag her down to the smoldering remains of the lodge, and force her to confess. But I was the sheriff. I had sworn an oath to uphold the law, to administer justice fairly and impartially. I couldn't let my personal feelings cloud my judgment, no matter how justified they might be. The conflict raged within me, a battle between my personal outrage and my professional duty that I knew that if I directly involved myself in the investigation, I would be compromising its integrity. Every decision I made, every action I took, would be scrutinized, second-guessed, and potentially challenged in court. The defense attorney would have a field day, arguing that I was biased, that I had a personal vendetta against Deborah, and that the entire investigation was tainted, that I needed to be smart, that I needed to be strategic, that I needed to ensure that justice was served, but in a way that was beyond reproach. After speaking with the district attorney, a longtime friend and confidant, I made the difficult decision to recuse myself from the initial investigation. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. To step aside, to relinquish control, to entrust the investigation to others when every fiber of my being screamed for me to take charge. I appointed my second-in-command, Deputy Sheriff Michael Davies, to lead the investigation. Davies was a good cop, honest, diligent, and by the book. That I trusted him implicitly, that I knew he would follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of who it implicated. "Mike," I said, calling him into my office the morning after the fire, "I need you to take the lead on the lodge arson case." He looked at me, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sheriff, are you sure about that? I know how much that place means to you and your dad." "That's exactly why I need you to handle it," I replied. "I can't be objective. That I'm too close to it. That I need you to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation, and I need you to keep me informed every step of the way." "Understood, Sheriff," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let you down." I knew he wouldn't. But recusing myself didn't mean I was stepping away entirely. I would be monitoring the investigation closely, reviewing the evidence, and providing guidance when needed. That I just had to be careful to avoid interfering directly in the process. The first few days were agonizing. That I felt like I was walking on eggshells, constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I was doing the right thing. That I spent hours poring over the preliminary reports, scrutinizing every detail, looking for any clue that might point to Deborah. But I had to be patient. That I had to let the investigation unfold naturally. I also had to manage Dad. He was understandably distraught, consumed by grief and anger. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. That I tried to reassure him, to tell him that we were doing everything we could to find the person responsible. But I couldn't tell him about Deborah. Not yet. That I didn't want to raise his hopes prematurely, only to have them dashed if the evidence didn't pan out. "Just trust me, Dad," I said. "We'll get to the bottom of this. I promise you." But trust wasn't enough. That I needed to do something, anything, to feel like I was contributing to the investigation. So I started digging. I started talking to people, asking questions, gathering information. I knew I was walking a fine line, potentially jeopardizing the investigation. But I couldn't help myself. That I had to do something. That I had to find a way to channel my anger and my grief into something productive. And I had to make sure that Deborah, the HOA Karen who had tormented my father for so long, wouldn't get away with destroying our sanctuary. The first week of the investigation was an exercise in frustration. Davies was doing his best, but he was hampered by a lack of resources and, frankly, a few deputies who were more interested in donut breaks than detective work. The crime scene, already compromised by the fire, yielded little in the way of concrete evidence. The accelerant residue was too degraded to identify the specific type, and the forced entry point was too chaotic to yield any usable fingerprints. The biggest problem was the lack of witnesses. The lodge was isolated, surrounded by dense woods. No one had seen anything, or at least, no one was willing to come forward. Fear, I suspected, played a significant role. Deborah, for all her outward appearances of suburban respectability, had a way of intimidating people. They knew she was litigious, vindictive, and capable of making their lives miserable. That I tried to offer Davies suggestions to steer the investigation in the right direction, but I had to be careful not to overstep. That I couldn't afford to be seen as meddling, as interfering in the process. So I confined myself to asking questions, offering gentle prods, and subtly pointing out areas that might have been overlooked. One evening, Davies came to my office, his face etched with weariness. "Sheriff, we're hitting dead ends at every turn. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and we have no solid leads." "What about Deborah Harding?" I asked, trying to sound casual, as if I were simply brainstorming. "Has she been interviewed?" Davies sighed. "Yes, sir, we interviewed her the day after the fire. She denied any involvement, of course, said she was home asleep all night. Her husband corroborated her story. Did you check their alibi? Yes, sir. We spoke to their neighbors. They confirmed that the Hardings were home that night, but no one could say for sure that they didn't leave the house at some point. What about security cameras? Do any of the surrounding homes have surveillance systems? We checked, Sheriff. Unfortunately, none of the cameras capture the road leading to the lodge. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a knot of frustration tightening in my stomach. We were chasing shadows, grasping at straws. We had a strong suspect, a clear motive, and a history of animosity, but we lacked the hard evidence to tie Deborah to the crime. Davies, I said, I want you to canvass the neighborhood again. Talk to everyone, even those you've already interviewed. Look for anything, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem. Someone must have seen something, heard something that we just need to find them. He nodded, his expression determined. I'll do it, Sheriff. That will keep digging. But deep down, I feared that we were running out of time. Deborah was smart, cunning, and ruthless. She wouldn't sit idly by while we built a case against her. She would be covering her tracks, manipulating the evidence, and potentially even intimidating witnesses. That I knew I had to do something more, something bolder. That I couldn't rely solely on the official investigation. That I needed to take matters into my own hands, to use my own resources, to uncover the truth. No matter the cost, I had to find a way to break through the wall of silence that surrounded Deborah, to expose her for what she was, a cold-blooded arsonist who had destroyed my father's sanctuary. And I wouldn't let her get away with it. Deborah's arrogance, I discovered, was her greatest weakness. She believed herself to be untouchable, a master manipulator who could orchestrate events from behind the scenes without ever getting her hands dirty. She underestimated the power of small-town gossip, the interconnectedness of the community, and, most importantly, she underestimated me. While Davies and his team were hitting dead ends with the official investigation, I was quietly working my own sources, leveraging the network of informants and contacts I'd cultivated over years as sheriff. That I started with the HOA at IT was a tight-knit group, prone to infighting and backstabbing, but also fiercely loyal to its own. That I knew that if I could find someone willing to talk, I could crack the case wide open. IT took time, but eventually, I found my inside man, a disgruntled HOA member named Bob, a mild-mannered accountant who had grown tired of Deborah's domineering personality and her constant power plays. Bob had witnessed firsthand Deborah's obsession with bringing Dad's property into compliance, and he'd overheard her making disparaging remarks about him on numerous occasions. She was obsessed with that lodge, Sheriff, Bob told me during a clandestine meeting at a local diner. She saw it as an eyesore, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the neighborhood. She kept saying that it had to be dealt with, that something had to be done. But it wasn't until after the fire that Bob heard something truly incriminating. That a few days after the lodge burned down, Deborah had called an impromptu HOA meeting at her house. Ostensibly, the meeting was to discuss the neighborhood's response to the tragedy, but in reality, it was an opportunity for Deborah to bask in the aftermath of her actions. She was practically giddy, Sheriff, Bob said, his voice hushed with disbelief. She was talking about how the problem had finally been solved, how the neighborhood could finally move on without that eyesore dragging down property values. Bob said that several other HOA members had looked uncomfortable during Deborah's gloating, but no one had dared to challenge her. They were all too afraid of her, too intimidated by her power. Did she mention anything specific about the fire? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Not directly, Bob replied. She never explicitly said that she set the fire, but she didn't have to. The implication was clear. She was taking credit for it, without actually admitting anything. What was even more astonishing, Bob revealed, was that Deborah had no idea that I was the sheriff's son. She saw me as just another resident, another face in the crowd. She had no idea that she was bragging about her crime to the very person who had the power to bring her to justice. Deborah's overconfidence was staggering. She thought she was untouchable, that she could get away with anything. But she was wrong. She had underestimated the strength of my resolve, the depth of my connection to my father, and the reach of my authority. Armed with Bob's information, I felt a surge of renewed determination. That I finally had a solid lead, a piece of evidence that could potentially break the case wide open. It was time to turn up the heat on Deborah, to let her know that she wasn't as clever as she thought she was, and that her actions were about to have some very serious consequences. Bob's testimony was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it was still circumstantial. We needed something more concrete, something that would directly tie Deborah to the arson. I instructed Davies to discreetly intensify surveillance on her, hoping she would slip up, make a mistake. And, as it turned out, Deborah's arrogance would be her undoing. The turning point came unexpectedly from an unlikely source, the local garden center. Deborah, it seemed, had a penchant for meticulously manicured flower beds, and she frequented the garden center several times a week, purchasing expensive plants and supplies. One afternoon, while browsing the fertilizer aisle, she engaged in a conversation with another customer, a chatty middle-aged woman named Carol. Carol, as fate would have it, was the wife of one of my deputies, a fact that Deborah was blissfully unaware of. Carol later recounted the conversation to her husband, who, in turn, related to Davies. According to Carol, Deborah had been complaining about the lingering smell of smoke in the neighborhood, attributing it to the careless burning of debris on a nearby property. Then, she made a slip-up, a careless comment that sent a chill down my spine. "It's funny," Deborah had said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "how quickly things can burn when you use the right kind of fuel. Makes you wonder why that old man didn't just tear down that eyesore himself." The phrase "right kind of fuel" was the KEY.IT wasn't something that someone who was merely speculating about the fire would say. IT suggested knowledge of the specific accelerant used to start the blaze, information that was not publicly available. Davies immediately alerted me to Carol's statement. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of vindication that we finally had something solid. A direct link between Deborah and the arson. It was the break we had been waiting for. I ordered Davies to bring Carol in for a formal interview. She was initially reluctant, nervous about getting involved, but Davies assured her that her testimony was crucial to the investigation and that she would be protected. During the interview, Carol repeated her account of the conversation with Deborah, adding further details that reinforced the incriminating nature of her statement. She described Deborah's smug demeanor, her knowing tone, and the distinct impression that she was gloating about the fire. Carol's testimony, combined with Bob's statement about Deborah bragging about solving the problem, provided us with a powerful foundation for building our case. It was no longer just a matter of circumstantial evidence and suspicion. We now had credible witnesses who could testify to Deborah's motive, her knowledge of the arson, and her overall culpability. The tide had turned. Deborah's overconfidence, her careless tone, had finally betrayed her. She had underestimated the power of a seemingly innocuous conversation. The ripple effect of small-town gossip and the relentless pursuit of justice. It was time to move forward, to gather the remaining evidence, and to prepare for Deborah's inevitable downfall. The game was no longer about proving her guilt. It was about building a case that was so airtight, so irrefutable, that she would have no chance of escaping the consequences of her actions. And I, as the sheriff, was determined to make sure that justice was served, not only for my father, but for everyone who had been victimized by Deborah's arrogance and her insatiable thirst for control. With Carol's testimony in hand, we shifted our focus to building an airtight case against Deborah. Davies, with renewed vigor, spearheaded the effort, meticulously gathering evidence and leaving no stone unturned. First, we obtained a warrant to search Deborah's property. The search yielded several potentially incriminating items, including a can of kerosene, a common accelerant used in arson cases, in her garage. While the kerosene itself wasn't conclusive evidence, it added another layer to the circumstantial case we were building. Next, we delved deeper into Deborah's background, exploring her past disputes and her history of erratic behavior. We contacted law enforcement agencies in the other communities where she had lived, and we uncovered a pattern of similar incidents: petty vandalism, harassment of neighbors, and a general disregard for the law. This evidence, while not directly related to the arson, painted a picture of a woman who was prone to conflict, vindictive, and capable of extreme measures. We also focused on Deborah's motive. We documented the escalating land dispute with my father, the numerous complaints she had filed, the legal threats she had made, and her overall obsession with bringing his property into compliance. That we presented this evidence to the district attorney, arguing that Deborah had a clear and compelling motive for wanting to destroy the lodge. But the most crucial aspect of our investigation was finding evidence that would directly link Deborah to the scene of the crime. That we knew that she had an alibi. But we also knew that her husband was likely covering for her. We needed to find something that would prove she was lying. Davies assigned a team of detectives to re-canvass the neighborhood. Focusing on the hours leading up to the fire, they interviewed every resident, showed them photos of Deborah, and asked them if they had seen anything suspicious. Finally, after days of relentless questioning, they found a breakthrough. A teenage boy who lived down the street from Deborah admitted that he had seen her driving away from the direction of the lodge around 2 a.m., about an hour before the fire was reported. He had initially been reluctant to come forward, fearing Deborah's wrath, but Davies had convinced him that his testimony was essential to bringing her to justice. The teenager's statement shattered Deborah's alibi. It placed her near the scene of the crime at a crucial time, and it contradicted her husband's claim that she had been home asleep all night. With the evidence mounting against her, we began to consider the possibility that Deborah had not acted alone. Arson is a difficult and dangerous crime, and it was possible that she had enlisted the help of an accomplice. We investigated her contacts, her associates, and anyone who might have had a motive to help her. We scrutinized her phone records, her bank statements, and her email correspondence, but we found nothing that suggested she had collaborated with anyone else. It appeared that Deborah had acted alone, driven by her own twisted sense of justice and her insatiable need for control. She was a lone wolf, a self-appointed guardian of suburban conformity, who had gone to extreme lengths to enforce her narrow vision of the world. With all the pieces of the puzzle finally in place, we were ready to make our move. The case against Deborah was solid, compelling, and irrefutable. It was time to bring her in and confront her with the evidence. And I, as the sheriff, was determined to be the one to deliver the news that her reign of terror was finally over. Before authorizing Deborah's arrest, I meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence with the district attorney. We scrutinized the witness statements, the forensic reports, and the documentation of Deborah's past behavior. We wanted to ensure that our case was not only strong but also legally sound, capable of withstanding any challenge from her defense attorney. Satisfied that we had met the burden of proof, I made the decision to proceed with the arrest. It was a moment of profound satisfaction, a culmination of weeks of relentless investigation, personal sacrifice, and unwavering determination. But it was also a moment of somber reflection. I knew that arresting Deborah would have far-reaching consequences, not only for her, but for the entire community. I decided to be the one to personally oversee the arrest. I wanted to witness the moment when Deborah's reign of terror finally came to an end. I gathered a team of deputies and drove to her house, the same McMansion at the end of my father's driveway that had been the source of so much conflict. It was mid-morning, and Deborah was outside tending to her meticulously manicured flower beds. She looked up as we approached, her expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Sheriff," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "What is the meaning of this?" "Deborah Harding," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with arson in connection with the fire at the Thomas Walker Hunting Lodge." Her face paled, and her eyes widened with disbelief. "Arson?" she stammered. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing wrong." "I advise you to remain silent," I said. "You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As we placed her in handcuffs, a crowd began to gather. Neighbors emerged from their houses, their faces a mixture of curiosity and shock. They watched in stunned silence as Deborah, the self-appointed guardian of their pristine community, was led away in handcuffs. The scene was a public spectacle, a moment of profound humiliation for Deborah. She had always prided herself on her social standing, her respectability, and her control over her environment. Now, she was being stripped of all of that, exposed as a criminal in front of the very people she had sought to impress. As we drove her to the county jail, Deborah remained defiant, insisting on her innocence and vowing to fight the charges. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer in control, that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. At the jail, she was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed. The mugshot, with her disheveled hair and her tear-streaked face, would soon be plastered across the local news, a permanent reminder of her fall from grace. News of Deborah's arrest spread like wildfire through the community. The HOA was thrown into chaos as members grappled with the shocking revelation that one of their own had been accused of such a heinous crime. Some were outraged, others were fearful, and still others were secretly relieved that Deborah's reign of terror was finally over. For my father, the arrest brought a measure of closure, a sense that justice was finally being served. But it didn't erase the pain, the grief, or the loss of his beloved lodge. That would take time, healing, and the unwavering support of his family and friends. But for me, the arrest was a victory, a triumph of justice over evil that I had kept my promise to my father, and I had brought the person responsible for destroying our sanctuary to account. But I knew that the battle was far from over. The trial was still ahead, and I had to be prepared to fight for every inch. To ensure that Deborah would face the full consequences of her actions, Deborah's arrest sent the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association into a tailspin of epic proportions. The meticulously maintained facade of suburban harmony shattered, revealing a seething undercurrent of infighting, blame-shifting, and panicked self-preservation. The HOA members, once united in their pursuit of pristine lawns and uniform mailboxes, turned on each other with a ferocity that rivaled a pack of wolves. Accusations flew, alliances crumbled, and long-held resentments bubbled to the surface. Some members, those who had been intimidated by Deborah's power and had silently condoned her actions, now scrambled to distance themselves from her. They claimed they had always disapproved of her tactics, that they had been powerless to stop her, that they were just as shocked and appalled as everyone else. Others, those who had actively supported Deborah's agenda, now faced the uncomfortable reality that they might be held liable for her actions. They had blindly followed her lead, trusting her judgment, and now they were staring down the barrel of a potential lawsuit. A financial disaster that could bankrupt the entire HOA. The HOA board, once a bastion of suburban authority, was now a battleground of recriminations and finger-pointing. The president, a meek and indecisive man named Mr. Henderson, resigned in disgrace, unable to withstand the pressure. The vice president, a sharp-tongued woman named Mrs. Peterson, stepped into his place, only to be immediately challenged by a rival faction led by Bob, my inside man, who saw an opportunity to seize control and implement much-needed reforms. The HOA's legal counsel, a nervous young lawyer named Mr. Davis, frantically tried to assess the extent of the HOA's liability. He warned the board that they could face a civil lawsuit from my father, seeking damages for the destruction of the lodge and the emotional distress he had suffered. He also warned them that they could face criminal charges for aiding and abetting Deborah's arson, if it could be proven that they had knowingly supported her illegal activities. The HOA members, realizing the gravity of their situation, began to turn on Deborah. They publicly condemned her actions, stripped her of her membership, and vowed to cooperate fully with the authorities. They even offered to testify against her in court, hoping to mitigate their own liability, but it was too late. The damage had been done. That Deborah's actions had exposed the HOA's dark underbelly, revealing a culture of entitlement, arrogance, and a complete disregard for the rights of others. The HOA's reputation was tarnished, its credibility was shattered, and its future was uncertain. Some members even suggested dissolving the HOA altogether, arguing that it was no longer serving its intended purpose and that it had become a breeding ground for conflict and resentment. Others vehemently opposed the idea, fearing that it would lead to chaos and anarchy. The debate raged on, fueled by fear, anger, and a desperate desire to salvage what was left of their community. But one thing was clear. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association would never be the same. Deborah's actions had forever changed the dynamics of the neighborhood, leaving a legacy of distrust, suspicion, and a profound sense of loss. As for Deborah, she was ostracized, abandoned by her friends and neighbors, left to face the consequences of her actions alone. The HOA, once her source of power and validation, had become her prison, a constant reminder of her downfall. The silence from the HOA was deafening, a stark contrast to the constant stream of complaints and legal threats she had once directed at my father. It was a silence born of shame, regret, and a desperate desire to erase her from their collective memory. Confined within the sterile walls of her jail cell, stripped of her designer clothes and her carefully constructed facade, Deborah finally began to grasp the gravity of her situation, the reality of facing arson charges, potential jail time, and the complete disintegration of her social standing sank in, replacing her initial defiance with a desperate plea for leniency. She requested a meeting with me, a request that I initially hesitated to grant, that I knew that anything she said could be used against her, and I didn't want to give her an opportunity to manipulate the situation, to try to weasel her way out of the consequences of her actions. But the district attorney convinced me that it was worth hearing her out. He argued that it might provide us with valuable insights into her motives, her state of mind, and potentially even lead to a plea bargain that would save us the time and expense of a trial. So I agreed to meet with her. I walked into the interview room, steeling myself against any attempt at manipulation or emotional blackmail. Deborah was sitting at the table, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked nothing like the confident, self-assured woman who had once terrorized my father and the entire HOA. "Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." "I'm here to listen, Deborah," I replied, my voice neutral. "But I'm not making any promises." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I know I've made mistakes," she said. "Terrible mistakes. And I'm so sorry. So sorry." "Sorry isn't going to bring back the lodge, Deborah," I said, my voice hardening. "Sorry isn't going to undo the damage you've caused." "I know," she sobbed. "I know. But I was so angry, so frustrated. I just wanted to make things right, to protect the neighborhood. That I never meant for things to go this far." "You started a fire, Deborah," I said. "You put people's lives in danger. You destroyed a man's home. How can you say you didn't mean for things to go this far?" "I wasn't thinking straight," she pleaded. "I was under so much pressure. The HOA, the neighbors, they were all counting on me to fix the problem. I felt like I had no choice." "You always have a choice, Deborah," I said. "You chose to commit arson. You chose to break the law. You chose to destroy my father's property." She hung her head, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I know. And I'm willing to do anything to make amends. Anything at all." "What do you have in mind?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "I'll testify against the other HOA members," she said. "I'll tell you everything they knew, everything they did. I'll expose their secrets, their lies, their corruption." I raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want in return, Deborah?" "I want a lighter sentence," she said. "I want a chance to rebuild my life, to start over. I don't want to spend the rest of my days in prison." I considered her offer. It was tempting, to use her as a tool to expose the rot within the HOA. But I couldn't trust her. She was a master manipulator, and I had no doubt that she would twist the truth, exaggerate the facts, and do anything to protect herself. "I appreciate your offer, Deborah," I said, "but I'm not interested in making any deals. I'm only interested in seeing justice served. And that means you facing the consequences of your actions." Her face crumpled, and she began to sob uncontrollably. "Please, Sheriff," she begged. "Don't do this to me. I'll do anything. Anything." But the damage was done. She had crossed the line, committed an unforgivable act, and there was no turning back. Her desperate plea fell on deaf ears. I stood up and walked out of the interview room, leaving her to wallow in her own self-pity and regret. The trial of Deborah Harding was a media circus, a spectacle that captivated the attention of the entire county. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and disgruntled HOA members, all eager to witness the downfall of the woman who had once wielded so much power. The prosecution presented a compelling case, meticulously laying out the evidence against Deborah. They called Carol, the woman from the garden center, who testified about Deborah's incriminating comment about the right kind of fuel. They called Bob, the HOA informant, who testified about Deborah's gloating remarks about solving the problem. And they called the teenage boy who had seen Deborah driving away from the lodge around the time of the fire, shattering her alibi. The defense attorney, a slick and experienced lawyer from the city, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the witnesses were unreliable, and that Deborah was being unfairly targeted because of her involvement with the HOA. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented a clear and compelling narrative, painting a picture of a woman driven by malice, consumed by resentment, and willing to do anything to get her way. Deborah took the stand in her own defense, But her testimony was unconvincing. She denied any involvement in the arson, claiming that she had been home asleep all night. But her demeanor was nervous and evasive, and she struggled to maintain eye contact with the jury. The prosecution cross-examined her relentlessly, grilling her about her past disputes, her legal threats, and her overall obsession with my father's property. They exposed her lies, her inconsistencies, and her overall lack of remorse. The most impactful moment of the trial came when my father took the stand. He testified about the history of the lodge, the memories he had created there, and the devastating impact that the fire had had on his life. He spoke with a quiet dignity, his voice filled with sorrow but also with unwavering resolve. That lodge was more than just a building, he said, his eyes fixed on the jury. It was a part of my soul. That it was a place of peace, a place of solace, a place where I could connect with nature and with my family. And she took that away from me. She destroyed something that was irreplaceable. His testimony brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom, including some of the jurors. That it was a powerful reminder of the human cost of Deborah's actions, the pain and suffering she had inflicted on an innocent man. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. They found Deborah Harding guilty on all counts, including arson, criminal trespass, and reckless endangerment. The courtroom erupted in applause as the verdict was read. My father squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with tears of relief. Justice had finally been served. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecution argued for the maximum penalty, citing the severity of the crime, Deborah's lack of remorse, and the devastating impact on my father. The defense attorney pleaded for leniency, arguing that Deborah was a first-time offender, that she had suffered enough, and that she deserved a chance to rebuild her life. The judge, a stern and experienced jurist, listened intently to both sides before delivering his sentence. He condemned Deborah's actions in the strongest possible terms, calling them malicious, vindictive, and utterly reprehensible. He sentenced her to 15 years in state prison, the maximum penalty allowed under the law. He also ordered her to pay restitution to my father for the full cost of rebuilding the lodge, a sum that was estimated to be well over $2 million. As Deborah was led away in handcuffs, she turned to face me, her eyes filled with hatred and defiance. "You haven't won, Sheriff," she snarled. "This isn't over." But I knew that it was. Her reign of terror was finally over, and she was about to pay the price for her crimes. The legal proceedings had concluded, but the healing process was just beginning. The years following Deborah's trial brought a measure of healing and closure, not only for my father and me, but for the entire community of Whispering Pines. The HOA, fractured and discredited by the scandal, ultimately disbanded. Its reign of petty tyranny brought to an end. A new, more inclusive neighborhood association emerged in its place, one that prioritized community building and cooperation over strict adherence to arbitrary rules. My father, though forever marked by the loss of his beloved lodge, slowly began to heal. The grief was still there, a dull ache in his heart, but it was gradually replaced by a sense of peace and acceptance. He spent his days tending to his garden, fishing in the creek, and spending time with his family. The restitution from Deborah, though substantial, was never fully realized. She had depleted her assets on legal fees, and the remaining funds were tied up in complex legal proceedings. But my father wasn't concerned about the money. That he was more interested in rebuilding the lodge, in reclaiming the sanctuary that had been stolen from him. With the help of friends and family, he began the slow and painstaking process of rebuilding. That he used the original blueprints, salvaged stones from the wreckage, and painstakingly recreated the lodge, stone by painstakingly placed stone. Timber he'd felled himself and seasoned with care, just as he had done decades ago. It wasn't an exact replica, but it was close enough. And more importantly, it was imbued with a new sense of meaning, a symbol of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of family. For me, the experience had been transformative. It had tested my resolve, challenged my values, and forced me to confront the complexities of justice, family, and the abuse of power. I had learned valuable lessons about the importance of remaining objective, even when driven by personal outrage, and about the corrosive effects of arrogance and entitlement. I continued to serve as sheriff, but I approached my job with a new sense of humility and a renewed commitment to upholding the law fairly and impartially that I made it a priority to address the underlying issues that had contributed to Deborah's actions, to promote dialogue, understanding, and a sense of community within the county. That I often reflected on Deborah's case, on the choices she had made, and on the tragic consequences that had followed. That I couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for her, for the wasted potential, the squandered opportunities, and the self-inflicted wounds that had led to her downfall. But I also knew that she had to be held accountable for her actions, that justice had to be served, not only for my father but for everyone who had been victimized by her arrogance and her insatiable thirst for control. That in the end, the story of Deborah Harding was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power corrupts, that unchecked ambition can lead to destruction, and that even the most meticulously constructed facade can crumble under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And as I stood on the porch of the rebuilt lodge, watching the sunset over the rolling hills, I felt a sense of profound gratitude for my father, for my family, and for the community that had supported us through it all. The fire had taken away our sanctuary, but it had also revealed the strength of our bonds, the resilience of our spirits, and the enduring power of hope. And that, I knew, was something that no one could ever take away from us.